From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
Charlotte is a petite woman in her 40s. When we met her, she had her quite long, dark hair pulled up very neatly into a clip at the back of her head. She was wearing a casual denim jacket. She's a very, very neat-looking woman. She works as a carer, which usually involves sort of getting up quite early in the morning, going to bed quite late at night. And what she has to work around this work schedule is travelling over an hour from her house in Avignon in the south of France to go and visit her husband in Aix-en-Provence. Aix is a popular tourist city, but she isn't there for a weekend break. In fact, she's there to visit her husband in prison, and he's in prison because he's one of the men who raped Gisèle Pelicot. I think surprisingly to some, Charlotte is standing by her husband, and she isn't the only one of the wives of the convicted men who are standing by their husbands.
When the extraordinary case of Gisèle Pelicot came to trial, it made global headlines and sent a ripple of shock across France. Amid an outcry, there were calls for changes to French rape laws and fundamentally to the culture. But within weeks of the trial concluding, of the 51 men convicted, now more than a dozen are appealing their sentences, and at least 6 are already out of prison. Some have even returned to their old jobs and their old lives. Gisèle Pelicot famously waived her right to anonymity in her rape trial, saying it was time that shame changed sides. But has it? Has anything in France actually changed? The story today, why Gisèle Pelicot's rapists are getting out of prison.
My name is Katie Tarrant, and I'm a news reporter for the Sunday Times. I have been following the Pelicot case since the first week of the trial. So I was in France, in Avignon, the week that it started, and I actually ended up interviewing one of the defendants in the trial while the case was ongoing. I've spoken to more than a dozen people connected to the case since, and having covered the trial when it finished in December, I just still had so many unanswered questions about what the impact will have been. And so I pitched the editor going back to France and asking this question: has shame changed sides?
And just remind us of the Gisèle Pelicot case and why it became such a global story.
So the trial started in September last year, and immediately you had the world's media focused on this case. So there were 51 men who stood trial for rape and sexual assault. Almost all of those were the rape of sexual assault of Gisèle Pelicot. She was this 72-year-old grandmother, and the rapes had been orchestrated by her husband, Dominique. He had been consistently drugging her and using an online platform called Coco, inviting men to rape her while she was unconscious in their home in this very small, tight-knit community in the south of France called Manveen.
And just remind us of how that trial ended.
It ended after hundreds of hours of video evidence was shown of what had been going on, because Dominique had actually been recording what had been happening at the time, with all 51 men convicted. So the shortest sentence was 3 years, the longest sentence was 20 years. That was for Dominique Pelicot himself.
At the time, Gisèle Pelicot became almost an icon because she was very open about what had happened to her. Just describe that phenomenon.
Well, that's the other reason that the case was so extraordinary, is because Gisèle decided to waive her right to anonymity because, as she put it, shame must change sides. And she was standing up in court and telling sexual assault victims, it's not for us to feel shame. It was a complete cultural movement in France. It questioned this undercurrent of misogyny in French society, and it prompted activists to suggest that French rape laws should change. So it really was this cultural moment, something I think comparable to Me Too that we saw, almost a decade ago now.
Have any of those changes happened?
Not yet. There's been a lot of talk about changing French rape laws because it lacks that element of consent that we have in the UK and other European countries have. But so far, nothing's happened yet.
We'll come back to the changes that people were looking for from this case. But before we do, you've met a lot of the people who are involved in this case, including some of the now convicted rapists and their partners, their families. We heard a bit about Charlotte earlier, this woman who drives for over an hour every week to visit her husband in prison. Just tell us a bit more about her. I mean, where did you meet her?
My colleague Ella Joyner and I were able to access court documents that the public haven't seen. From these documents, we were able to work out where some of the women around these men might be living. And we decided we would make sensitive approaches to them. That included knocking on Charlotte's door. She lives in a third-floor gated apartment block in the outskirts of Avignon, where the metropolitan part of the city centre bleeds into the beautiful Provence countryside. There were lots of pensioners walking around. I mean, it was completely unnecessary for her to be living in a gated apartment because it felt like one of the most sort of tranquil and calm places to live. But Charlotte invited us in, and she had an impeccably clean and minimalist apartment. Very few paintings on these off-white walls. It was lovely open plan, and there was a glass table in the centre of her living room. And we sat with Charlotte at this table and had a remarkable conversation about what the last few years have been like for her.
And is Charlotte her real name?
No, she is the first of the partners of the convicted men to give an interview about her experience, and she asked for her and her husband's names to be withheld in fear of her safety. And I think this is quite a legitimate concern because we'd been told, both by Charlotte, by other women we spoke to, and by their lawyers, that some of the wives have had their cars torched, that their children have had to drop out of their schools because there has been this outrage at the men, and that's sort of affected the families as well.
Tell us a bit about her relationship with her husband. I mean, how did they first meet?
She met her husband out and about in Avignon, and they started dating in 2013. He was raised by a strict and traditional large family. And when they got together, there was a bit of a cultural difference between them. And it meant that his family basically rejected him when he said that he was going to marry her in 2018. And she mentioned this because she felt that he had stood by her, and therefore now she wants to stand by him.
What was their life like as a married couple before this case happened, before her husband was arrested?
Yeah, well, I think it was quite a normal life to all extents and purposes, and they'd been living together for a number of years. They both worked, but they had also been planning to start a family. They'd been planning to start a process of IVF when he was arrested.
That relatively normal life, them trying to have children, all of that obviously comes to a very abrupt end when the police arrive at the door. What did she make of that?
She was actually out working. As I said, she was a carer, and she was out working very late at night, and she had a nephew staying round. And it was the nephew, who's only 18, that called her and said her husband had been arrested. And actually, he initially told her that he'd been arrested for theft, because the word for theft in French is very similar to the word for rape. So he'd actually misheard it. And it was only when the police called Charlotte herself and invited her to the police station, she said she looked, it was a female officer, she looked at her face and she realised this wasn't an arrest for theft. At that point, the officer told her what her husband had been accused of. She said one word: impossible. Then she was asked to give a strand of her hair because, as we know, Dominique had this pattern of drugging Gisèle, and the police at the time, as they were investigating, were worried that some of the other husbands might have done this to their wives. And even at that point, she just thought, I'm really angry, but I'm going to get his side of the story, because she just couldn't comprehend what was going on. And she did break down in tears as she was recounting this moment to us.
So she goes from this initial reaction of feeling like this is impossible, this can't have happened, to, as the case progresses, realising that it clearly did. How did that play out for her?
So they sort of try to start rebuilding a relationship. He goes back to work. He starts saving some money because he essentially knows that he's going to be sent to prison once the trial starts. And once that does commence, she ends up spending 20,000 euros in legal fees to support him. There's also the cost of prison to contend with.
The cost of prison, is that not free?
No, I mean, it's something that she said that she had to contribute to. So that was the cost of his food and for television. And she said to us, it's the families who have suffered more than the accused themselves. Most of the women have lost their jobs. Most of the kids have stopped going to school. In the last sort of year or so, she's been in and out of hospital every month or so because of the stress. She said it was carnage.
Did she actually watch the trial play out? Was she in court?
She did attend the second day of her husband's trial. She described it as frenzied and that it was a bit of a media circus. And because the men were judged as a group, that potentially they didn't get a fair trial. And that is something that other defendants have said themselves.
How did it end for him? What was he convicted of?
Charlotte's husband was convicted of the aggravated rape of Gisèle Pelicot, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison.
I mean, what's his justification for what happened? What does he say about the case?
In court, he recognised that what he had done had an impact on Gisèle, and he felt some level of empathy for her. But essentially, he said it wasn't his fault. He said that he was manipulated by Dominique Pelicot. He said, like many of the other men, that once Dominique Pelicot had approached him online, he'd made him think that either Gisèle had consented to being drugged or that she was playing a game and pretending to be asleep. So essentially, he had been manipulated into raping her.
Wow. What does his wife, what does Charlotte think?
So as I said, she was angry in the first 2 months while he was in prison, initially after his arrest. But then she said, the only thing that I would reproach him for is that he trusted people too much. And our overwhelming impression from that conversation was that she believes this narrative that he was manipulated by Dominique Pelicot.
That would imply she didn't mind him going to basically sort of have an extramarital affair.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that's something that was a cause of anger for her in the first place, but certainly 3 years on from his arrest, the impression she gave us was that that's not something she thinks about now.
Did she say how she felt about Gisèle Pelicot, having been in court and having understood what happened to her?
I think this was one of the most extraordinary elements of the interview for me, given that we've seen hours and hours of video evidence of what was being done to Gisèle. Charlotte said that at the beginning of the trial, she did feel sympathy for Gisèle, but the longer it went on, she felt less and less. And her justification for this, which we shouldn't go into in too much detail, is that she questioned whether the narrative of the trial was accurate.
Katie, you've told us about Charlotte and her husband. They clearly feel like they've somehow been wronged by the case. What about the other 50 men? Do you know how they're viewing the case, the trial, and how it all happened?
Within 10 days of the trial's conclusion, 17 of those men, so that's about a third of the total convicted, had lodged appeals against their convictions. That was either essentially saying they disagreed with the fact they'd been sentenced at all, or they disagreed with the length of their sentence. Some of those have now been withdrawn, but at least 6 of the men are now out of prison. I should say with a few of them, they weren't sent to prison when the trial concluded because they were in a position of ill health. But there are others who had served time before the trial started, and therefore, once they'd got their sentence of around 3 to 5 years, were able to walk free at the end of the trial.
Wow, that feels so counterintuitive. Is that normal in France?
It's somewhat normal. The French parole system is different to the English parole system in that it entitles prisoners to apply for early release if they've served, in some cases, a third of their sentence whereas usually in the UK it's half, or obviously in the early prisoner release scheme, about 40%. But the rules are especially flexible if the prisoner is over 70, has demonstrated good behaviour, or has a property that they can return to.
Have all of the families welcomed these men back in the way that Charlotte has?
No, I mean, when we were driving through these sort of small towns that, I mean, some of which were, less than 10 minutes away from Mazan, which sort of gave you this eerie sense of the journeys that some of these men might have taken. There were lots of empty properties where we understood that this used to be the family home. You would knock on the door and see the convicted man's name on the letterbox, but nobody's answering. And you'd ask local people in the town, do you know this man? Do you know the family member? And they'd say, oh, they've left. And we met the neighbours of another man living in a hamlet who said that they used to know the convicted man's father well and that he'd isolated himself from his community. So they'd walk past each other in the street and the father wouldn't make eye contact with anyone anymore.
And are there any more cases coming out of this, the initial trial? You mentioned earlier, for example, that some of the wives were having their hair checked.
I mentioned, obviously, that Charlotte had to go get her hair tested when she turned up at the police station, and a lot of the other women had to do this. During the trial, we learned that at least 3 of these tests were positive or suggested positive traces, and at least 1 woman had tried and failed to press charges against her partner for rape or sexual assault. And so you might be familiar with what Gisèle Pelicot's daughter is saying, which is that she believes that she was drugged and assaulted by her father, Dominique, but she has no proof of this. And I think this speaks to the fact that there will be other women out there who are wondering, did this happen to them? But they'll never get the answer to that question.
So difficult.
Yeah. In terms of other cases going forward, there are also new allegations against Dominique Pelicot. So he has been investigated in connection with the murder in 1991 of an estate agent called Sophie Nahm. He is also going to stand trial at some point for the attempted rape of a woman known only as Marion, which took place in 1999. He's actually admitted his connection to the case because DNA evidence from the time, which was retested recently, showed that he had this connection. So especially in terms of Dominique Pelicot, there will be ongoing charges.
Katie, you mentioned earlier that when this case came to trial, there was a lot of talk in France that perhaps this was the moment when something had to change, the culture had to change, but also the laws around rape. Just remind us of what those laws are and why people were talking about changing them.
Campaigners were calling for change because there's no concept of consent in French rape law at the moment. There was a movement previously within the EU to change this about a decade ago, and about 19 other countries took on this new definition, which integrated consent into their rape laws, but France didn't do that.
And just to clarify, if consent isn't part of their rape law, what in France constitutes rape?
Rape in France is a sexual act committed against a victim which has an element of surprise or coercion. And what campaigners say is that this might fit the stereotype of a perpetrator who jumps out of a bush and attacks a stranger, but it doesn't actually address rape where it's most common to happen, which is between people who know each other.
There was a lot of talk about these laws changing, about the sentences changing. Is there any sign that they're about to?
Well, at the time, President Macron voiced his support to review these laws. And actually, there was a French parliamentary report in early January which called to keep the current wording of the law, but to add in a reference to any non-consenting penetrative act. This is still ongoing. And obviously, it does take a while to change a law. But crucially, I do actually think that the definition of rape is just one aspect of what could change following this case that would actually have an impact on the culture in France.
Tell us about that, because it does feel like whether it's the laws around rape, the sentences, which seem more lenient than they would be in other countries perhaps, but also sort of the attitude of some of the wives and the families to their husbands when they have been convicted. It does feel sort of quite peculiarly French. This is a country that we know Me Too happened elsewhere in the globe, but it seemed to pass by France at the time. There was a lot of talk around Gisèle Pelicot that this was the moment when the culture in France would actually change. Do you think it is changing, or is the culture just too entrenched?
I remember the first week of the trial when I was reporting on it, hearing the mayor of Manveen, where Gisèle and Dominique Pelicot lived, question why there was so much press attention on this case, because nobody had died. And so there was this implication that
Wow.
a mass rape case wasn't really something that we should all be interested in talking about, which I think was quite indicative of a certain attitude. The MPs that are calling for consent to be worked into the law said in their report that stereotypes still exist in society of supposedly good victims and real rape, which is something we heard during the trial, the sort of defence lawyers saying, but it wasn't actually rape because he didn't mean to do it. And the thing that I think is most significant is what these perpetrators actually understand about their actions. Dozens of the accused men denied rape in court, despite video evidence against them, because they said they thought it was part of a game or that she had given consent through her husband. One man actually said that he had learned what consent meant only when he was in prison awaiting trial. And others said that they thought they had obtained consent because they had done so through Dominique. And so I think the question of where we can change this culture in France starts before the law even comes into play. It starts in schools, in conversations that mothers and fathers have with their children, and it starts by tackling these attitudes towards women as objects that are either possessed by their husband or an object from which you don't need to seek consent.
And for the woman at the heart of all this, the woman who finally forced France to have this conversation, Gisèle Pelicot, do we know what's happened to her now?
Yeah, so she has left her home in Manveen. She's dropped her married name. She told the Sunday Times last month that she doesn't want people to become bored of her or forget what we learned as a result of the trial, but she is also trying to return to a normal way of life.
And what about Charlotte and her husband? What happens to them next?
Well, Charlotte says that she hopes her husband will be released within the next year. I think probably on the terms of good behaviour, at which point he will have served around 3 years of his 8-year sentence. What we found quite extraordinary is that she told us his employer has told him that he'll get his job back when he leaves prison, despite being someone who was sentenced at one of the most high-profile trials that France has seen in the last decade, century. And we are asking ourselves the question while we're reporting on this as to whether shame has really changed sides, which is what Gisèle Pelicot said. And I definitely think that, we've seen rape victims in France waive their anonymity incredibly bravely. And I do think for victims, there has been this sense of shame changing sides. But after speaking to some of the men throughout this trial, I do wonder whether they are feeling that shame themselves.
That was the Sunday Times news reporter Katie Tarrant. The producer today was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Edward Drummond. Theme music was composed by Mal Lassetto and sound design was by Hannah Farrell. If you want to get in touch with us about this or any other subject, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.